Hey, Greg, what's up?
Yeah, I'm good. Everything is okay.
You're co-host, so you got the control of everything, my friend. Let me see if I'm live streaming. Everything's good.
I mean, don't leave us all together, because who knows? I mean, I don't know. I can let people in, but you know, I'm not used to do anything else.
No, all you have to say is, well, I muted everybody when they're coming in. I'm just, when Paul comes in, click on his name and it says make a co-host, and just click on his name and make him a co-host, and everybody else is going to be muted. And then you're going to ask him to raise hand. And when you see a raised hand, you will just click on the name of the person, and, you know, and then you could just unmute them. That's all.
All right.
Let me just go online and tell people that we're on.
But okay. But what, are you going to be leaving right now, right away?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably stay for 5-10 minutes. I'll leave. I'm not leaving. I'm staying on, but I'm not going to be.
All right. I can send you a text message if I need you. Okay.
Yeah, send me a text message, and we will. But I'm going to watch it on YouTube too, so because I'm live streaming it right now. So.
Right. Okay. All right.
All right, brother.
Okay.
Anybody coming in, just admit people, please.
Yeah. Sure. I'll watch for that.
Also, if you see Paul, just click his name and make him a co-host. Okay, because he needs to share.
Just click on this left click, right, and then I could make it, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Not attractive. Don't aspire to be like that. That looks really good. What is it?
The Sunday.
Oh. Hey. By the way, Zach, you hear me? Here is Paul, right?
Hello, everybody.
Hey,
Hello.
how are you doing? So let me see it. Zach said that I should make you, I can make you a co-host. How do I do that? Okay, let me see.
Hey, Paul, how are you? How are you guys? So, Greg is
I don't-
the moderator today, or how? Yes, hi.
I don't know how to make a co-host. It doesn't
No,
work.
I already made him a co-host. He's a co-host.
Okay, all right.
All right, I'll mute now. Paul, hi, how are you? And I'll talk in a few guys. You guys know what to do.
Okay.
But
Let's just wait a few more minutes. It looks like people are signing up. Paul, don't worry. I'll admit the people. I'll admit people.
Good,
Okay?
thank you. Thank you.
I'll watch for that. And let's see. Okay, while we're waiting, just want to say, maybe I'll repeat it later. So everyone is muted for now, except Paul and I. And if you want to make a comment or ask a question, use chat, or if you really need to say something, raise a hand. And the way you raise hand is you go to reactions on the bottom and you raise hand, and then I'll at some point I'll unmute you and let you ask a question if you feel that you need to vocalize. Otherwise, if you put it in chat, I'll be watching, and at some point I'll ask Paul to stop and read your question. The reason we do this is because there are a lot of people participating. Usually we have more interactive conversations, but a lot of people participating, so we don't want to overload it. But we'll have definitely a Q&A session after the presentation, and I will unmute everyone. All right, let me see, what is it? It's only 2 minutes, okay. Let's make it 5 more minutes.
Looks like we have a full house today.
Yeah, it looks like we have, I don't know, Zach said could be close to 50, but well, whatever, maybe not. Maybe a couple more minutes. And we'll go. Still have people joining. Okay, I think we can start, and I'll just want to say a few words before. Again, I repeat some rules that I've said before. So my name is Greg. I will be moderating, and Paul will be presenting. So everyone is muted, and if you have any questions or comments, please put it in the chat. I'm going to watch it, and at some point I'll read your questions to Paul. Also, if you really feel a strong urge to vocalize your question or comment, you could raise a hand, and I will let you speak at some point. So that's basically it. Okay, Paul, take it away.
Okay.
Yeah, share screen.
Thank you.
Let's start.
Here we go.
What the fuck? It's already starting.
What?
Shit.
Oh, Christ.
Well, yeah. How do I? Oh man.
Well, I mean, people can actually just turn off the view of other.
Yeah, I will watch it, and
Just look at-
I'll remove as soon as that starts. I apologize for that. You know, unfortunately.
What happened, guys?
There
Somebody.
was a picture,
Yeah, somebody
photographic
started
picture.
the pornography. I removed the guy. It's Henry P. I don't know who that is, but hopefully.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Sorry, guys. I don't know what. I mean, I did take out the sharing ability, so I don't know how you was able to share it. I don't know.
He just put the pictures. They put the video.
Oh, the video. Maybe. What
Yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah,
do is-
on his personal screen, not
All right.
on.
I'm gonna unmute start video for them. Okay. Now it should be work. It should work now. Okay.
Okay.
So they
Does
can't
everybody
show
see
it.
does everybody see my screen?
Yeah, I see it. So anybody want to, if you don't see it, please put it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
Very good then. So to start, my name is Paul. I am a history buff. I'm not a historian or any sort of academic. And this is just things that I research out of my own love for this subject, and hope we can have a good discussion, and I hope everybody enjoys. The Roman Republic was founded in 509 BC and ended in 27 BC when Augustus Caesar became the first emperor. Rome had risen from obscurity to become the ruler of the entire Mediterranean world, only to collapse in a paroxysm of factionalism and bloody civil war. Today, I want to talk about the early stages in the process of collapse. It was Rome's very success that sowed the first seeds of its subsequent demise. These seeds were the consequences of the wealth that flowed into Rome when it conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms in Asia and Greece. The first signs that this was happening began to appear around 155 BC. This is when we begin to see the erosion of the norms of political and social behavior that had held the state together for the previous 350 years. First, we need some political background. The absolute high point of the power and status of the Senate was reached around 200 BC. At this stage of Roman history, the so-called struggle of the orders had been settled, and the Senate consisted of both patricians and plebeians. The elite among them were the nobles, men who had an ancestor who held the office of consul. The Senate's power rested in its exclusive control over the key activities of the state, the conduct of foreign affairs in peace and war, and the control of state expenditure, the power of the purse. The first 200 years of the Republic had been characterized by strife between the patricians and the plebeians. To defend themselves from the patricians, the plebeians formed a unique political organization, essentially a state within the state. Each year, the plebeian assembly elected 10 tribunes of the plebes. Only plebeians could vote. The fundamental attributes of these tribunes is that they were divinely protected, sacrosanctus. Any injury done to a tribune was therefore a crime against the gods. Anyone guilty of killing a tribune could be hunted down and killed on sight with no legal consequences. An interesting side note, Augustus thought sacrosanctus was important enough for him to claim it for himself when he became emperor as one of the fundamental pillars of the Principate. The second power of the tribunes, intercessio, was a consequence of sacrosanctus. A tribune could intercede to protect a plebeian from the powers of other magistrates. And since you couldn't interfere with the tribune, you therefore couldn't interfere with the tribune protecting, essentially interposing his body between any magistrate and someone that the tribune sought to protect. An example might be if a tribune interceded when troops were being enlisted to exempt selected individuals. The next power was the veto, and it was extremely powerful. A tribune could veto the laws passed by any assembly, as well as the acts of the Senate and elected officials. Veto means I forbid, and it essentially would stop any of those things in their tracks. And finally, the most long-lasting power of a tribune was to propose laws to the plebeian assembly, plebiscita. Only plebeians could vote on these laws, but they were binding on the entire state. But by the middle of the 4th century, the role of the tribunes had changed. The leading plebeians were rich and powerful as well as talented, and the patricians realized that it was in their interest to co-opt the plebeian leaders into the ruling class. The historical record shows that by the year 350, plebeians had begun to serve as consuls, censors, and dictators, the highest offices of the state. As a consequence, the plebeian organization lost its revolutionary character and was transformed into a mechanism of senatorial control. For ambitious young plebeians, the tribunate now served as a first step on the political ladder. Some of these young career seekers could be relied upon to use their veto to enforce rather than to defy the will of the Senate. A.E. Aston, in his political biography of Scipio Aemilianus, observes that by 200 BC, the tribunician veto was a key element of the maintenance of senatorial authority. Any undermining of the veto would ease the way towards defiance and circumvention of the wishes of the majority of senators. Or as Cicero put it, what college of tribunes is so desperate as not to have 1 out of 10 be sane, from his point of view? What about the democratic element in the Roman constitution? The public assemblies, in theory democratic, did not in fact function that way. The senators were able to control the assemblies by mobilizing their well-cultivated networks of clients and retainers to apply pressure on their behalf. This was made easier by the fact that there was no secret ballot, so voters were subject to reprisals if they supported measures opposed by the Senate. So that's the background. I want to take a moment to recommend an excellent website covering this period of Roman history. It's called factsanddetails.com, and you will find a well-informed presentation and thoughtful analysis of this material. And for those of you who may be interested, I will paste a link in the chat at the end of the presentation. This stuff is, I was really impressed by this. It was really good. I learned a lot from it. So my narrative today begins with a Roman patrician named Publius Cornelius Scipio, born around 220 BC. Scipio enjoyed some distinctions. He was a member of the College of Augurs, which was a highly prized office. Augurs were responsible for taking the auspices to determine whether the gods were favorable to any action contemplated by the Roman state. Unfavorable signs might result in the abandonment of treaties or military campaigns. But unfortunately for Scipio, he had some type of physical infirmity, not really specified in the sources, and therefore Scipio did not proceed any further up the ladder of public offices. As Scipio grew to middle age, he needed to address a major problem. He had no sons to perpetuate the family name of the Cornelii Scipiones.
Excuse me, Paul.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine. Apologize. Go ahead.
Yeah, Scipio's lack of an heir was particularly problematic because he came from one of the most illustrious families in the Republic. He was the son of the great Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal, Rome's mortal enemy. It was the son's duty to find a way to perpetuate this famous line. So Scipio sought help from a close ally, Aemilius Paulus. Paulus was the leading member of another ancient patrician clan, the Aemilii. His father of the same name had held the office of consul during the Second Punic War. The senior Paulus was one of the commanders at the Battle of Cannae. Cannae cost the lives of 60 to 70,000 Romans, including all of the generals, and was the most famous defeat in Roman history. This painting, made in 1787 by John Trumbull, commemorates the catastrophe. The Aemilii were connected to the Cornelii Scipiones through marriage. Scipio Africanus had married Paulus's sister Aemilia, so Scipio was therefore appealing to his uncle for help. Paulus had 4 sons. Believing that his own line was secure and realizing that he could not support 4 sons through full political careers, Paulus decided to prevent the extinction of the Scipiones by allowing Scipio to adopt his second son. This happened sometime between 187 and 168 BC. By the way, all dates that I'm going to say are BC now, so I won't keep repeating that. Adoption among noble families had a long history in Rome and was a very significant public act. By this adoption, Scipio obtained an heir, and Paulus's second son became Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, known to history as Scipio Aemilianus. The adoption made Scipio Aemilianus the grandson of the great Africanus and heir to his political legacy. Similarly, Paulus allowed his oldest son to be adopted into the distinguished and ancient clan of the Fabii, thus becoming Quintus Fabius Maximus Aemilianus. Tragically for Paulus, his two younger sons died in their teens. So after saving the Scipiones and the Fabii from extinction, the line of the Aemilii Paulii ended with Macedonicus. Aemilius Paulus was one of the most distinguished Romans of all time and was the subject of one of Plutarch's lives. Plutarch celebrates Paulus for his integrity, incorruptibility, and mildness of manner. He was also an unwavering supporter of Rome's traditions and conventions, which is to say that he was a strong defender of the rights and privileges of the senatorial nobility. Paulus is best remembered for his leadership of the Roman army that defeated the Macedonians in the Third Macedonian War. This war marked the effective conquest of Greece and allowed Paulus to claim the cognomen of Macedonicus. The war was decided at the Battle of Pydna in 168, during which the Roman manipular legion demonstrated that it could defeat the feared Macedonian phalanx. Paulus's two sons, Scipio and Fabius, accompanied Paulus on the campaign. Polybius tells us that Scipio presaged his future heroic reputation by pursuing the fleeing enemy with such zest that he lost contact with the Roman army and for a time was feared dead. Following the Roman victory, the brothers spent a considerable amount of time hunting in the Macedonian royal game preserves, and hunting became a lifelong passion for Scipio. It is recorded that he devoted so much time to hunting that he neglected the traditional career preparation of elite Roman youth. This is the practice of attending the Roman Forum to build political relationships with his peers and to gain clients he could call upon in the future by prosecuting or defending lawsuits on their behalf. This proved to be a significant liability for Scipio Aemilianus, and as we will see, may partly explain why he repeatedly used tactics that violated political norms and depended on the support of the common people to defy the wishes of the Senate. By this, I think it is fair to say that Aemilianus contributed to the ultimate downfall of the Republic. Scipio's time in Greece is also when he met the statesman and historian Polybius. Polybius became Scipio's mentor and a permanent part of Scipio's entourage. Subsequently, a group of Hellenized Roman nobles and Greek intellectuals gathered around Scipio, now known as the Scipionic Circle. Writing 100 years later, Cicero made an idealized version of Scipio into a hero of his philosophical dialogues. And since then, this has informed our image of Scipio. So back to Paulus and his campaign in Macedonian Greece. In 167, Paulus began his trip back to Rome to celebrate a triumph. On his way home, he received instructions from the Senate to pillage the cities of Epirus. After misleading the Epirotes about his intentions, Paulus sent detachments to the Epirote cities, and simultaneously, on an appointed day and time, his soldiers fell on the inhabitants and seized the cities. In that 1 hour, writes Plutarch, 150,000 persons were made slaves, and 50 cities were sacked. All the booty taken by Paulus flowed into Rome. Plutarch tells us that Paulus was less than generous to his soldiers, but also refused to take anything for himself. This was the second massive infusion of wealth into Rome in 25 years, the first being the one that followed Rome's victory in Asia against the Seleucid Empire. The effect of these gifts from the gods was insidious. Rich Romans began to assemble huge plantations, the latifundia, worked by the newly acquired slaves. Small peasant proprietors and freeborn tenant farmers were forced off the land. These independent farmers constituted the recruiting base for the legionary infantry and were thus the source of Rome's military power. So this was a very poor sign for Rome's future history. For a while, the decline of the small farmers remained concealed. The inpouring of money into Rome financed a tremendous construction boom. And so for a while, this provided employment opportunities for many of the people forced off the land. Additionally, the Macedonian War was followed by 15 years of relative peace. This meant that the demands for soldiers were modest and didn't overly stretch the pool of available manpower. We now have to introduce some new characters into the narrative. Scipio Nasica Corculum, who came from a different branch of the Cornelii Scipiones, had married Africanus's eldest daughter. Corculum was a gifted military commander who played a decisive role in Paulus's victory in the Battle of Pydna. He was also the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, and Princeps Senatus, leader of the Senate. Corculum was a staunch conservative, and he resisted political and cultural innovations, particularly Hellenism. So you can see here the intertwining of these families, and at the same time, their internal divisions, since you see Scipio Nasica resisting Hellenism, and you see Aemilianus as the patron of a Greek historian and one of the leading people studying Greek philosophy and leading the introduction of Greek ideas, or the new generation of Greek ideas, into Roman society. Corculum, Scipio Nasica Corculum, had a son, Scipio Nasica Sarapio. The exact origin of the cognomen Sarapio is murky, but what is clear is that Sarapio was a derogatory nickname given to him by his political enemies. Sarapio's conservatism was even more extreme than his father's, and he has a major role to play in the events that follow. The next person we need to look at is Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, consul of 177, who married Africanus's younger daughter. These two people had two sons, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus.
18 in our series.
I apologize.
Tiberius and Gaius are the famous Gracchi brothers. The Gracchi had a sister, Sempronia, who married Scipio Aemilianus. Scipio Sempronius Gracchus, the father, was a leading member of the plebeian nobility and was one of the dominant figures of his time. He was twice consul and was awarded 2 triumphs. He campaigned successfully in Spain, where he negotiated lasting peace treaties favorable to Rome. He was also a member of a senatorial embassy to the rich city of Pergamum in Asia Minor, where the embassy ratified a peace treaty between Rome and Pergamum. We must assume that Tiberius acquired many clients in both Spain and Pergamum. Pergamum sometimes sent envoys to report to the Senate, and when they were in Rome, these envoys stayed at Tiberius's house. These connections to Spain and Pergamum will be important resources during the turbulent career of his son, the young Tiberius Gracchus. In later generations, Cornelia was venerated as an exemplar of upright Roman motherhood and was known as Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi. The family was a popular subject for 18th and 19th century artists. In this painting, Tiberius Gracchus is the young man with the red garment standing on the right. Next to him is little brother Gaius, and next to him is sister Sempronia reaching out to the seated Cornelia. Starting in 156, Rome entered a period of almost uninterrupted war, sometimes fighting as many as 4 wars at the same time. Under this pressure, some of the forces eating away at the Republic began to manifest themselves. In 153, Marcus Claudius Marcellus was elected consul, even though he had been consul only 3 years before. This violated a law requiring a consul to wait 10 years before seeking that office again. The reason given for the exception was expediency. The war in Spain was not going well, and Marcellus was an experienced and effective military commander. But it also violated a precedent that had stood for 50 years. The war in Spain was not going well, and it was extremely unpopular with the people. The Spanish were seen as particularly fierce warriors. The country was poor and would not provide much booty to soldiers, and legionaries in Spain had to serve for 6 consecutive years. A crisis arose in 151 when the people resisted the consul's call for fresh troops to serve in Spain. Some of the tribunes interceded to exempt some individuals from the levy. When the consuls refused to go along, the tribunes threw the consuls into prison. So this really demonstrates the tremendous power of the consuls, their veto, the power of intercessio, and the power that no one could mess around with the tribune, and the effort of the consuls to get around it. This is the moment when Scipio Aemilianus makes his first appearance on the public stage. Enrolled as a young military tribune, that is to say, a young staff officer, Scipio made the dramatic public gesture of volunteering to serve in Spain, intentionally shaming those who had refused to serve. Polybius, admittedly biased in favor of Aemilianus, tells us that the gambit was entirely successful. Scipio's popularity soared, and young men flocked to the colors. Scipio's successful gambit to become popular with the people became a recurrent theme throughout his career. During the fighting in Spain, Scipio established his reputation as a military hero. His exploits included killing a military captain in single combat and winning a rare military honor, the Corona Moralis, awarded to the first soldier to scale the enemy's fortifications. Scipio and his supporters took care to see that his exploits were widely publicized. As we will shortly see, Scipio used the popularity he gained to further his intense political ambitions. It now seemed that the time-honored methods used by the Roman elite to achieve political power by mobilizing their networks of clients and connections were no longer enough. Last and most dangerous to the equilibrium of the Republic was the growing determination to find ways to overcome a tribunician veto. Scholars argue that when the consuls were jailed during the recruiting crisis of 151, the tribunes must have vetoed the draft and jailed the consuls for defying the veto. In 148, Rome was once again at war with Carthage, and as with the war in Spain, the war was not going very well. The exception to this was Scipio Aemilianus. Serving as a junior officer, Scipio's heroism won him Rome's highest military honor, the grass crown. When the campaigning season was over, Scipio returned to Rome to seek election as an aedile, a relatively minor office. In a move that A.E. Aston describes as constitutionally outrageous, the people elected Scipio to the consulship. Scipio's election was illegal for several reasons. First, Scipio was at least 5 years below the minimum age requirement. And second, he had not held the prerequisite office of praetor. In addition, Scipio's election was opposed by the preceding consul and the entire Senate. Appian, writing in the 2nd century AD, tells us that when the consuls showed them, which is the people, the law, the people persisted and became vehement. In the end, one of the tribunes said that he would deprive the consuls of their right to conduct the election unless they complied with the wishes of the people. The sources convey the impression that this election was a spontaneous action of the populace, the people. But Plutarch also tells us that Scipio's escort included, quote, men who frequented the forum and were able to gather a crowd and force all issues by shouting and inciting passions. So not necessarily a spontaneous outpouring of emotion. At this point in his career, Scipio was making enemies faster than he was making friends. In addition to repeatedly flouting the wishes of the Senate, the sources tell us that Scipio had a vicious wit that he used against his opponents, deepening their bitterness. The humiliation which Scipio inflicted turned his occasional opponents into long-term enemies. At the end of Scipio's year as consul, when provincial commands were assigned to the outgoing magistrates, Scipio once again put himself above the law. The constitutional procedure was for the consuls to draw lots for their provinces. But one of the tribunes proposed that the people should send Scipio to Africa to assume command of the war against Carthage. As with Scipio's unconstitutional election to the consulate, the grounds were immediate expediency, and once again, his popularity with the people enabled him to have his way. And one comment here, when we talk about the action of the tribunes and the actions of other, Scipio could not become a tribune himself because he was a patrician, and only plebeians could become tribunes. But there were working partnerships between leading politicians and tribunes. And this happened with Scipio, it happened with Gaius Marius and Saturninus, it happened with Julius Caesar. So you have something where we don't have documentation, but the coordination of activity between people like Scipio and the tribunes that were proposing laws and enacting vetoes that directly advanced its political ambition shows you how the system actually worked. You had 10 tribunes, and many of them were essentially bought. They were owned by individual factions in the Senate. So Scipio had prevailed and had been given the command of the war against Carthage. When he departed for Africa, Scipio was accompanied by his nephew, the young Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius was now a member of Scipio's entourage, with the opportunity to watch and learn from the great man. Scipio did not disappoint. He prosecuted the war with skill and tenacity and enhanced his reputation for bravery and leadership. The Third Punic War ended with the total destruction of Carthage. Polybius writes, Scipio, when he looked upon the city as it was utterly perishing and in the last throes of its complete destruction, is said to have shed tears and wept openly for his enemies. Then Scipio mused about the future fall of Rome, saying, a day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain. The reference is to the Trojan hero Aeneas, the ancestor of Romulus. But this wistful reflection does not mean that Scipio had decided to be merciful to the defeated Carthaginians. Quite the contrary. Scipio ordered Carthage to be burned to the ground and its farmland sowed with salt. 50,000 slaves were taken to Rome. Scipio Aemilianus, now the second Africanus and the dominant figure in Rome, returned to the city to celebrate a triumph. But Scipio Aemilianus at this point was not the only one to start bending the rules and trying to curry favor with the common people. Back in Rome in 145, the tribune C. Licinius Crassus became the first orator to turn away from the Senate House and address the crowd when he was speaking in the forum. In 143, the powerful patrician Appius Claudius Pulcher successfully avoided a tribunician veto. Appius had decided to award himself an unauthorized triumph, but this was promptly vetoed by a tribune. Appius ignored the veto and proceeded with his triumphal procession. But as a precaution, Appius took his daughter with him in the triumphal chariot. This daughter was one of the Vestal virgins and was therefore inviolate, similar to a tribune. When the tribune attempted to haul Appius out of the chariot, he hid behind his daughter, and the tribune, who could not touch her, was frustrated in his attempt to hold Appius to account. Serious unrest erupted in 138. In an effort to intimidate potential troublemakers, the consuls ordered a harsh public scourging of deserters from the Spanish wars. Nevertheless, the people resisted the consuls when the consuls began to levy new troops, and two tribunes interceded. In a virtual repeat of the recruiting conflict of 151, the consuls disregarded the tribunes, whereupon the tribunes once again threw the consuls into jail. One of the consuls sent to jail by the tribunes was Scipio Sarapio, who now emerged as the leader of the Senate faction that opposed any concession to the people. In the same year, when the city was experiencing problems with the grain supply, Scipio Nasica made himself even more unpopular by opposing a law to distribute grain to the common people. And once again, this was the beginning of the distribution of grain, something which we think of when we think of Roman people, bread and circuses, but it wasn't always like this. This was the beginning. We now come to a turning point in the life of Tiberius Gracchus. In 137, there was a military disaster in Spain. Through his incompetence, the army commanded by the consul Gaius Hostilius Mancinus was facing annihilation. Tiberius Gracchus was serving under Mancinus as a junior officer. I mentioned earlier that Tiberius's father had commanded an army in Spain, and while he was there, had assembled influential clients. As was the Roman practice, the father's clients were inherited by Tiberius Gracchus, his son. With their assistance, Tiberius was able to negotiate a treaty that spared the army from massacre or enslavement. But the Senate considered the treaty humiliating and unacceptable, and it had a religiously sanctioned procedure to use when it wanted to repudiate a treaty negotiated in its name. This procedure was to strip the responsible general naked and deliver him to the enemy bound in chains. Scipio Aemilianus, whom you may recall was Tiberius's uncle, intervened in the Senate to prevent the staff officers, particularly Tiberius, from suffering the same fate as their general. But for Tiberius, this was not enough. He believed that Scipio, the most important man in Rome, should have forced the Senate to ratify the treaty and vindicate Tiberius. Not only did Scipio refuse to do this, he actually used the incident to promote himself even further and utilized this enhanced clout to push through a law establishing the secret ballot. According to the sources, it was Tiberius's treatment concerning the repudiated treaty that turned him into an enemy of the Senate. Cicero wrote, "The harsh line with which the Senate took in disavowing Tiberius's treaty made him indignant and apprehensive, and the whole business drove this gallant and distinguished man to abandon the gravitas of his forebears." Turning his back on Scipio, Tiberius now formed an alliance with Scipio's arch enemy, Appius Claudius Pulcher. This is the same man who had conducted the unauthorized triumph and had avoided the tribunician Veto by hiding behind his daughter. To seal the arrangement, Tiberius married Appius Claudius's daughter. Appius Claudius opposed Scipio in the Senate and had enjoyed a number of successes when he allied himself with Scipio's other enemies. But Scipio, probably assisted by the new secret ballot, was able to confound his enemies and successfully stand for consul once again in 134. As with his first consulship, there was a law that should have prevented his candidature. But once again, Scipio's popular support forced the new legislation that exempted him from the restrictions. And as previously with his command in Africa, the people demanded that Scipio be given the responsibility for conducting the war in Spain. And incidentally, one of Scipio's junior officers in the Spanish campaign, the Numantine campaign, as it's called, was Gaius Marius, one of the most important figures later on in Roman history, serving here in his very first campaign. As Scipio Aemilianus left for Spain, Tiberius, back in Rome, stood for election as one of the tribunes of the plebes for the year 133 and was duly elected. The events of his tribunate were to open wounds in the Republic that would never heal. It started with his agrarian law. Rome had an unusual institution called the public land, the ager publicus. The ager publicus was agricultural land owned by the state. Often it was land that was taken as reparations during Rome's war against other Italian peoples in the process of the expansion of Rome in Italy. Roman citizens were entitled to use the public land up to a maximum of 500 Viguera, I think is how it's pronounced, which is about 320 acres. But rich landowners had helped themselves to much more than that. Small owners who needed to work the public land for basic subsistence were forced out. Now, the idea of an agrarian law was not new. 8 years earlier, a member of Scipio's inner circle had proposed an agrarian reform bill, but the Senate strongly resisted and the matter was dropped. Tiberius, on the other hand, was committed to fighting to the end. And what was worse, Tiberius's agrarian reform bill actually had teeth. It created a workable enforcement mechanism, the Land Commission, which was to be chaired by Tiberius's father-in-law, Appius Claudius Pulcher. The law was vetoed by one of the tribunes who supported the interests of the Senate. There can be little doubt that Tiberius knew in advance that this was coming. He had to know. So he had a plan. It was logical and simple, but also drastic. The veto could not be defied, therefore it must be removed. And that meant removing the tribune who had imposed it. Tiberius put forward a proposal that declared that his antagonist was no longer a tribune of the plebs, and this bill was overwhelmingly approved by the assembly. The other tribune withdrew amid jeers and threats, and perhaps some fistfights. The Senate's response was to deny any funding for Tiberius's Land Commission. The agrarian reform was now law, but it could not be implemented without funding, and the Senate had exclusive control of finances. At this point, an unpredictable event changed the situation. The king of Pergamum died. Pergamum was fantastically rich and had been a longtime ally of Rome. Rome had a history of gradually intruding itself on its allies and changing that status of ally to a more subservient position. The king of Pergamum had no heirs, and to basically seeing the inevitable was coming, in his will, he bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. Pergamum sent envoys to Rome to inform them of the bequest. And as their previous times coming to Rome, since they had been clients of Tiberius's father, they stayed at Tiberius's house. Tiberius thus became the first Roman to know what had happened. He went to the assembly early the next morning and introduced a law that appropriated the entire Pergamene legacy to finance his agrarian law. This was a body blow to the Senate and must have caused shock and rage. Nothing remotely like this had ever happened any time before in Roman history. But calmer heads prevailed in the Senate. After all, Tiberius's year in office was almost up. Soon the senators could stop worrying about Tiberius and set about undoing his accomplishments. And then Tiberius announced that he wasn't going away. Instead, also unprecedented, he declared that he would stand for another tribunate. The implication was that Tiberius, now the most powerful man in Rome, could remain as tribune as long as he liked. This was the last straw. For the Senate, they lost all control. You could call this a freak out. It was no longer possible to restrain the senators who demanded immediate action against Tiberius and his followers. After arming themselves with makeshift weapons, the senators and their supporters rushed out of the Senate House. They were led by none other than Scipio Nasica Sarapio, Tiberius's cousin by marriage. During the ensuing riot, Nausicaa is said to have killed Tiberius with his own hands by bashing Tiberius's head in with a wooden stool. By the end of the day, 400 supporters of Tiberius had been slaughtered and their bodies had been thrown into the Tiber. So what actually happened here? I don't think it was the agrarian law that turned the Senate into a murderous mob. In fact, the Senate subsequently allowed the agrarian law to go into effect, and Tiberius's land commission functioned as he envisioned for several years after the riot. What really disturbed the Senate was that Tiberius had usurped their power, most notably by seizing the Pergamene legacy, and then had shown them that he could stay in office indefinitely. This the Senate could not tolerate. A decade later, history repeated itself with the tribunate of Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus. Gaius attacked the Senate even more explicitly than Tiberius had. According to Plutarch, Gaius believed that he could not accomplish anything without weakening the power of the Senate. Notably, he intervened in the courts that tried Roman officials on charges of corruption, and he banned senators from serving on these anti-corruption juries. Since the vast majority of the defendants in such trials would have been senators, Gaius's action meant that the senators would no longer be able to protect each other from their corrupt activities in the provinces. Furthermore, Gaius actually succeeded in serving for a second term as tribune. But when he declared that he was candidate for a third term, the populace had turned against him. Using a pretext, the supporters of the Senate had rioted again and murdered Gaius and many of his supporters. The murder of the Gracchi was a lasting wound. The Popularis and the Optimates, the factions that tore the Republic apart in the 1st century BC, both factions trace their origins to the Gracchi and their opponents. One question remains. Why did the Gracchi do this? What were their motives? The ancient sources were split. Plutarch and Sallust defended the Gracchi and saw them as true champions of the common people. Note that Sallust was a partisan of the ultimate popularis, Julius Caesar. And Plutarch cited as his source a political pamphlet issued by Gaius Gracchus. And Plutarch lived more than 100 years into the empire. And the grass always looks greener. The memory of the Republic may have seemed easy to forget the flaws. In contrast, Cicero, who was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, and Appian, who was a 1st century AD historian, saw the Gracchi as embittered revolutionaries seeking to destroy the Roman state. And indeed, some of their policies and connections would seem to bear that out. The grandiose patrician Appius Claudius, Tiberius's father-in-law and chairman of the Land Commission, was a self-serving faction leader, a narcissistic patrician, not a principled defender of the common man. And it was the wealthy equites, the Roman knights, not the common people, who benefited from Gracchus's reorganization of the corruption courts. So that's a question that might be an interesting thing for us to discuss at this point, and to talk about any other comments or items to discuss that people might have coming out of my discussion. So that being the case, I'm going to stop sharing and open the floor.
Yeah, I think it would be the best if you could just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. and I will unmute you in turn. That would be one. I just wanted to ask one question until everyone else volunteer. What are the consequences of this method that Tiberius Gracchus used by abusing veto power? Because that has never been done before, when he basically like stopped the whole functioning of the city of Rome. I'm talking right at the beginning. What are the consequences of that? Was that continued later on? Did it show the way, or was it stopped?
Yes, it was absolutely continued later on. So, for example, Marius had an alliance with the tribune Saturninus, who passed his political agenda, and ultimately the Senate had to stone Saturninus to death in order to get rid of him and get rid of the veto. But the most important point that I was trying to make was that the veto had become, in my mind, the veto is very similar to the debate that's happening now about the filibuster. It was a way of kind of keeping control and preventing things from moving ahead faster than people were willing to do. Eliminating it had a very destabilizing effect. It meant that the things that had kept the state in equilibrium were falling away. And now the opportunities for opportunists and adventurers of both sides of the political spectrum was now wide open. And we can see from that point down to ultimately Julius Caesar's assumption of dictatorship for life, all of these norms of Roman behavior, political behavior, started falling away. And there's one more contemporary reference. I think many of us, when I was very surprised when Donald Trump became president, I was fairly confident that the American institutions would be resistant to the sort of things that he would do. And I didn't realize how important norms and conventions, things that were not written law, were to the way things function. And we all saw the sort of impact that occurred when norms and conventions were undercut, even though the laws themselves were not being changed. And this was the importance of the undermining of the tribunician veto.
Okay, James, go ahead.
So a quick one, little off course. J.S. Bach's The March of Scipio. How does that fit in?
I'm sorry?
The March of Scipio?
What about Scipio?
It's Johann Sebastian Bach.
Oh,
I can't remember.
I have no idea.
Very, very powerful piece.
I mean, all I can say is that Scipio was, as I say, he was made into a hero by Cicero. Scipio, some historians say that Scipio had the potential to become another Julius Caesar 100 years before Julius Caesar. He had mobilized the support of the common people. He had the sort of influence in the state that was not repeated really until Caesar. And he died kind of mysteriously with rumors of an assassination by his political opponents. But he was remembered as one of the greatest Romans. So it would make sense for someone to, pay tribute to him in an artistic piece. Kind of for the same reason that you see portraits of the Gracchi and other Roman leaders.
I actually wanted to know the land reform that Tiberius tried to implement it as a law. I mean, it was really genuinely necessary for the Roman society. I kind of feel that it was so important, and he kind of forced it down the throat of the Senate, and that caused the reaction. And that's probably was not a good idea. But what is the fate of this? How did it all? I know it became the law, and but eventually, did it work out? Did it become a workable solution?
No, it was, it functioned for about, I think somewhat less than 5 years. There were some land, and one thing to make clear about the law did not call for seizing any land held by private individuals. That had never been proposed any time in the history of Rome. But what it was a redistribution of public land that all Romans were supposed to have equal access to. And essentially, it just died. I think it was too little too late. And there was another comment that someone had put in the chat about saying that Tiberius's motive was his realization of the undermining of the Roman military. But I think that most modern historians see that as hindsight, that it wasn't really obvious at that point, and that Scipio had that Gracchus had some real strong personal motives to basically humble the people who had humbled him. And as I said, the historians point to the fact that the law that he passed was not unconstitutional on Roman standards. The Senate allowed it to go through. What was unconstitutional, and once again, it's by norms and conventions, was taking control of money, public money, and saying that, Tiberius was accused of wanting to become a king. And that may seem a stretch, but that's exactly what Julius Caesar was charged with. As soon as the Romans saw, the whole idea of the Roman system was that you had no single individual who was the undisputed leader, and that any time you had leadership, it was temporary. All of the Roman offices were for 1 year only, the offices that held what they called imperium, the right of command. And having someone say, well, I can actually maintain my power, even though a tribune did not have imperium, but he had the ability to propose law, and he was inviolate. You couldn't mess with him until they did.
He could veto everything until his law is implemented. That he
right, or until
everybody.
Until they said enough, and said he wants to be a king. And that for the Romans was, that was a war cry. That was something that that would be resisted by every Roman.
I didn't read exactly the chat, but someone put that he was more interested in the Roman army rather than land. Well, anyway, it's all connected. The idea that he wanted, because a lot of legionnaires got devastated because their land was confiscated. They would come back to nothing. Their children wouldn't continue a service because they were poor, not interested. Often don't have the drive to serve. So, the idea was that this land reform would benefit poor citizens who would at least have some land and would be able to sustain themselves and eventually serve in the army. So it was hurting the army, and that's why this reform. So how did the Romans dealt with it if they, got rid of the reform? But did they do anything else?
First, let's say that I think it's fair to say that the land reforms was an attempt to put the toothpaste back in the tube. It was too little, too late, and the corrupting force of the wealth that flowed into Rome. We saw the beginning of the free distribution of grain to the Roman people. you had it was the life on a farm. It was a small independent farmer, was very, very hard. It wasn't something that was, Tiberius he supposed that people would be running to come back and take their farms back and be farmers again, but that did not happen. People kind of liked their life in the city, and this was a trend. Once how are you going to get them back on the farm once they've seen Paris? That really happened, and the way that the Romans actually dealt with this is the innovations of Gaius Marius. So serving in the Roman army, in the Roman legions, had been something that was only allowed. Not only did you have to be a citizen, but you had to own a certain amount of property. You had to be in at least what was called the fifth property class. And there was a group of people Roman citizens underneath them, and they were the proletarii. This is the origin of the word proletariat. And you could define a member of the proletariat, I've seen it defined as being a person who was so poor that they could not afford to have even one slave. Now just think about that. That just tells you volumes about all of Roman's society as a slave society, the basis of it, and what constituted poverty. So Gaius Marius, who was another opponent of the Senate, became consul and achieved the command against the wishes of the Senate. And once again, the Senate said, okay, just like they did with Tiberius Gracchus, we won't fund any way for you to raise an army. So what Marius did is he went to the proletarii, people who were not previously permitted to join the army, and he opened military service to them, financing quite a bit of out of his pocket. And that's the beginning of private armies in the first century of Rome, where the army's allegiance was to their commander and no longer to the Roman state. And we see where that led in the Civil War and the war ultimately between Octavian and Anthony. So that's how Rome dealt with it. They basically privatized war. They enlisted desperate people who had nothing to lose and headed towards bloody anarchy and civil war at inexorable motion. It was like a slow motion train wreck.
Okay, Howard, go ahead.
Yeah, I was the one that was commenting on this one. I'm researching for Sulla and the Civil Wars, and I'm reading through Appian very carefully, and Gracchus is basically coming up and saying, look, we're running out of small farmers that are armed and useful in war, and replacing the slaves that are useless in a war and who are disloyal. So he seemed to be, that could be just the right argument. He just could be presenting the argument they would respond to. The other thing I'm wondering here is that nationalism, as we understand it, is early 19th century Common Era, as far as I can tell.
What was that?
Nationalism, as we understand it, is early 19th century Common Era. I'm assuming, and I haven't got to Gaius Marius yet, I can see where we're headed. And that's not my responsibility, but I still need to understand it. Did people have a clear, for an awful lot of people, their loyalties to peoples, it makes sense to me. If you assemble a professional army, your soldiers are going to be loyal to you rather than to some abstract state. But did the Romans have it?
Let me comment on that. So yeah. When we say that nationalism was a 19th century or late 18th century phenomenon, we're talking about the territorial nation state. Rome was essentially an overblown city-state. And the idea of patriotism towards your city-state goes back to the Greek archaic period, and it was extremely strong. In archaic Greece, you didn't consider yourself a Greek, you were an Athenian or a Spartan or a Theban. And similarly, you were a Roman, you were not an Italian. And the importance of Rome's symbols, which we see all over and we have adopted very largely in the United States, are a reflection of the power that had on common people. And we know how people are proud of being conquerors and winners and rulers of the world. And that was never more strongly the case than it was with Rome.
Mhm. But as a landowner, you're willing to run farmer. As a landowner, if you listen to Gracchus' speeches, you'd be aware of the fact that you're trashing Roman army recruitment.
Well, as I'm saying, I think, and there's some historians that say that this is really hindsight, that it was not that it wasn't really clear the direct connection. And maybe Tiberius was clear about it, and maybe it was one of his motives among others. And people make that argument, and maybe that was to some extent the case.
I'm reading Appian. This is first century AD, so they've had time to understand the consequences.
Yeah, well, that's the point. Is that when you have more time, you tend to have reached what they call teleological conclusions. In other words, you see what happened, and then you go back and you say, well, therefore, let me find what led us here. And then you see everything as kind of inevitable, when in fact, history tells you that none of these things are inevitable, and you miss the idea of historical contingency, that you don't know how events are going to work out in advance, and they might not work out that way. So whenever, and you see that it's a very common thing in ancient history. You go back and you say, well, we know how it ended out. What are the seeds of it? Where does it point? I mean, I said that as well myself, but it's a logical fallacy, and historians, real academic historians are very critical of it.
Yeah, I know that starting, especially in the first century BC, when Rome started to acquire a lot of new provinces, then they started this practice, and later during the imperial period, of new land, or retired legionaries usually were given new pieces of conquered land, and that's how they also populated. I know the most famous situation was at the time of Emperor Trajan, populating the Dacia province with retired legionnaires, and that eventually led to the whole transformation of the language and identity there. But I know Pompey specifically later on, I'm talking about, went through the all the way through the Asia Minor, and a lot of those territories became new provinces, a lot of new land. So I think that was one of the ways how they kept.
Yeah, well, let me comment on that, because I really discussed this at pretty great length in some of my presentations on Rome's expansion in Italy. So when Rome, really at the earliest point, back in 400 BC, when it conquered in 396, it conquered the city of Veii, and then it settled its veterans on the agricultural land that used to belong to Veii. And this is something that the Romans, that was the first time they did it, 397, and they had done it consistently ever since, especially if you had been a city that had been under Roman control and you revolted, then the Romans were sure that they would reconquer you, and they would confiscate large amounts of your property, and they would give it to their military veterans. The soldiers knew frequently that when they were fighting in a certain place, that they could very well end up owning big plots of land and being, part of the local ruling class. And it was a strong motivation. But the problem was that they were running out of land in Italy. There was nothing after the Romans conquered Italy, and after the war against Hannibal, there was no place left in Italy to give out. And if you recall, the first triumvirate with Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. The reason that that formed was that Pompey needed land for his veterans, but he was politically inept. He couldn't do it, and the Senate totally bamboozled him and ran him around in circles. And Julius Caesar, who was anything but inept, came forward and said, okay, here's the deal, Pompey. You back me. I want to be consul. I'll get land for your veterans. And Caesar did that. And that was the beginning of the first triumvirate, was where you had these three guys who were totally ruling the state and ignoring the wishes of the Senate. So we can see how the roots and these things festered and became, like the way a tree root can rip apart concrete. That's what happened.
But by that time, you had the professional army, and you had to get along with your professional soldiers.
Right, and it was your job as the general to find. You had to find land for them afterwards, and you had to find a way to get it sanctioned by the Senate. And Caesar was able to do that for Pompey. Pompey couldn't do it by himself.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Please raise your hand. I'll unmute you. I can, or put your comment in the chat. Well, there was okay.
You have a hand raised, Harry Phillips.
Yes, I see. Okay, I think I asked to unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure.
So one question that, you kind of, I don't know if you used the word co-opt, but in the beginning, you were talking about how the Senate, which is basically looks like an oligarchy, tries to include the voices of the plebs, right, in the government, so that it's a more, I don't know, want to use the word representative, but somehow it's a more balanced government, right? It's not.
That's a misunderstanding. I did say co-opted, but so here's what actually happened. The Senate, during the second half of the 5th century, had gone through something called the closing of the patriciate. In other words, the power was totally monopolized in the hands of the patricians. So this was, from around 450 to the early 300s. And the point was that among the plebeians, you had a wide range of different people who qualified as plebeians. They were not all common people, small guys. They included people who were tremendously rich and tremendously powerful, but because of their birth, they could not join the ruling class. So they would become leaders of the plebeian movement because it was the only way for them to have an independent political existence and exert power on their own. So you had this phenomenon where you had a lot of very talented but very rich and powerful people who were the leaders of the plebeian organization. And what the Senate did was co-opt the leaders. It wasn't that they became more democratic, quite the opposite. What they did is they emasculated the plebes. By taking the talented people out of the plebes, they expanded the notion of who was a noble. This was the beginning of what the word noble comes from the Latin nobiles. And the word noble is distinct from patrician. Nobiles included plebeians. It basically was anybody who's had an ancestor who was a consul. So what I'm saying is that they made these leading plebeians into members of the oligarchy. And what happened was that the plebeian political organizations, rather than representing the interests of the common people, changed their nature and became a method of social control, a method of political control, such that now to be a tribune didn't mean that you wanted, it was no longer your only choice if you were an ambitious plebeian. What it was a step on the ladder to becoming consul and joining the Senate. So you now had the tribunes were defending the interests of the Senate. So if you had some wild man tribune, if you had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a tribune, there'd be somebody else that would go in and say, I veto. So the veto became something that supported the oligarchy. It was no longer something that had a revolutionary character. So that's not immediately apparent, and it's not understood very well in kind of glosses over Roman history. But the net result of the incorporation of the plebeians was to decrease rather than increase the democratic functioning of the Roman state. And the increase in quote unquote democracy was Scipio Aemilianus. That's my argument. That's where it began to happen.
What you've said is kind of illustrated in the time of Tiberius Gracchus, because there was this Marcus Octavius, right?
Yes.
Who originally vetoed this land reform, worked for Senate, and then there was this whole situation that Tiberius banned him and expelled him. He deposed
him. It was like the first recall election.
Yeah, because he went to the plebs and said, well, he doesn't represent the constituency.
That's right.
And he is right.
And the historians say that this really created fear and apprehension, physical fear and apprehension on both sides, because there was marginal violence when this occurred. Nobody was killed, but there were some rows, there were some fist fights and stuff. And people started saying, well, this is starting to get serious now. We have to look towards defending ourselves. That ultimately meant the murder of Tiberius Gracchus.
Yeah, but that was an example how the Marcus Octavius was from the plebs, right? The tribune also, but he was in a way kind of co-opted by Senate.
Well, and keep in mind that the later Octavian that we're more familiar with, which is the man who became Augustus Caesar, never wanted to be reminded that his father was Octavius and that he was born into the gens or the gons of the Octavii, because they were plebeians. So even though the plebeians had a lot of political power, there was still a snob appeal of being a patrician. And it was a very common event for sometimes patricians would have, they would have bad fortune. They would lose their family fortune. And they would find some very aggressive plebeian aristocrats who wanted to get patrician blood into their family. So they would marry. And this is what happened with Julius Caesar, with Julius Caesar's family and Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius, who was a plebeian, married Julius Caesar's aunt, Julia.
Right.
And it was a deal made by Julius Caesar's grandfather, who was broke. And Gaius Marius was rich. And this was not an uncommon thing. So they give him an infusion of patrician blood in exchange for an infusion of money.
Yeah, that's what happened to Octavian too, because his mother Atia was from Julia.
That's
and
right.
That was the patrician
and so there was
brand, and
the patricians were the ones that could trace their lineage back to the earliest aristocracy of the Republic. Right. And in the case of Julius Caesar, he traced his lineage back to Romulus and Aeneas and the goddess Venus.
Yeah,
and
that was
reminding Octavian that he was a plebeian was, reminding him of something that he didn't want anybody to think about. And there was no better way to get yourself in the doghouse with Augustus, or before he became Augustus, than to call him Octavian. He wanted to be called Caesar. And if you didn't call him Caesar, you were his enemy.
Yeah, actually, specifically, his ancestor that he's referring to was a son of Aeneas, Iulus.
Julius, right.
And yeah, so that's where
Which is the way Julius is pronounced
yeah,
in Latin.
right,
Julius.
right.
There is no
So,
J in Latin.
yeah, so that was the idea, that's how this ancestry goes to Iulus and Aeneas, and of course we know that Aeneas was a son of Aphrodite, and therefore that was the reason why Augustus kind of or the Octavian kind of promoted Virgil to produce this epic Aeneid, is to really to connect him, to show, because it's his personal connection to that story. He is the legitimate princeps now, because he comes from not only royalty but from the goddess, from the Venus. Yeah, that's a very interesting.
Just
By
as
the way, princeps, the key to Augustus's rule was that he concealed what he was doing. Julius Caesar was very, very open about what he was doing. He had himself declared dictator for life. It seemed that he was angling towards being named as a monarch and possibly even being named as a god in his own lifetime. And Octavian was a very astute politician who saw this and said, well, this was a great mistake. Uncle Julius made a real big error. And the idea is to maintain the facade of Republican norms. And that's exactly what Augustus did. And his facade was that he was just the servant of the Senate, and that the Republic was really still in effect. And it became more and more obvious that was not the case, especially as his successors were not as skillful as he was.
Okay, so anyone else wants to ask a question, participate in discussion? Please raise your hand. Let's see. Just want to give you an opportunity.
If I could have a quick follow-up, just to go back to the killing of Tiberius Gracchus, you mentioned that, about the money that he had kind of taken over that they thought was terrible. But what do you think was the senator's primary motivation in hating him so terribly that they had to go out and kill him?
Well, I mean, it was kind of like everything. Everything about him was provoking them. So he had resisted their sanction. They had basically, said that he screwed up in Spain, and he was out to take his revenge. The biggest single thing was the antipathy of the Roman elite for having a single preeminent leader. This was the worst possible thing. I mean, there was no more dirty word in Rome than the word king. That was a dirty word. And Romans would talk. I mean, even if it wasn't true, if you wanted to attack a political rival, the way you would do it is you would say he wants to be king. That was like in today's thing saying that he's Hitler. And people would have an emotional reaction to it. And they felt that, it was, and that's why I compare it to the filibuster, that you needed to have a consensus in Rome. And anybody that seemed like they were going to overturn the idea that you required an oligarchic consensus and you could rule without them was your mortal enemy. It was an existential threat. And that's why, so the thing that he did with the Pergamene legacy, that it was symbolic as well as real. And it said that all these things that you thought were the basis of your power, I can take them all away from you tomorrow. All I have to do is walk into the assembly of the plebes and propose a law. They love me. They'll do whatever I say. And then, indicating that he would stand for election the next year, and by implication, no reason why he couldn't continue to stand for re-election for the rest of his life.
I
That
think
was-
also, yeah,
that was- Yes, go ahead.
it was a Senate's privilege to appropriate the fund. And that one of the ways how they wanted to fight that law that he implemented is by defunding it. It sounds familiar, like what's happening in our Senate,
Yes.
but but they wanted to defund it, and he found this way to implementing this law about this Pergamon's money, the inheritance, to his cause. So, but he basically threatened their privilege to appropriate money. That would like a major affront to the Senate.
You could, maybe it's a little stretch metaphor, but you could compare it to the actions of the Bolshevik government in repudiating their international debt in 1917. Right? Because the first reaction to them doing that was the invasions from all of the Western powers, and it was the repudiation of debt that really freaked them out. Because money is power, real power. And the Senate saw themselves losing their power. They no longer could control things, and they had to stop it before it was too late. And it was too late.
Okay. Anyone else have anything to ask or contribute? Let's give it some time to people. Yeah. Also, maybe I don't know if everybody knows where Pergamon is. I don't know. This is, I think, important. Maybe Paul wants to say, or I could.
The Pergamon is in what is today Western Turkey, and it was one of these independent kingdoms. By independent, I mean independent of the great Hellenistic super kingdoms. They were never part of the Seleucid Empire, and they were it's a really interesting story. They were formed by essentially stealing Alexander the Great's treasury and bringing it to Pergamum, and they were fantastically rich. They were a benefactor of Athens because Athens had become an international symbol of prestige, and they built the portico of Attalus in Athens, which people talk about today. Attalus was the king of Pergamum. He built this beautiful architectural thing in Athens. They had been an ally of Rome in Rome's war against the Seleucids, against Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, and were rewarded by Rome and started becoming territorially very large. But being an ally of Rome was really a two-edged sword, because Rome's attitude was always, what have you done for me lately? There was no long-term loyalty from Rome. So Pergamum and the island of Rhodes had the same thing. They had given Rome really important services around year 195. But by the time you got 25 years later, the Romans were saying, well, what have you done for me lately? And they were starting to really push their weight around. So I think Attalus saw that this was inevitable, that Rome was going to take over. Rome had established a province in Asia after their defeat of Antiochus, right next door to Pergamum. And it was clear that they would take over Pergamum. It was only a matter of time. And this was, at that time, the richest place of the world.
Yeah. So it was wise decision. By the way, there is still Pergamon site in Turkey on Mediterranean. It's on Mediterranean side. It's up kind of like northern half of Mediterranean in Turkey. I haven't been there yet, but I've seen the pictures. So it's still worth the visit. So it's
Pergamum was so rich that they could actually compete with the huge Hellenistic kingdoms.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting story. The Egyptians had a monopoly on papyrus because it was made from plants that only grow native in Egypt. And when the Hellenistic kings started becoming competitive, the Egyptians, or the Ptolemy, basically would not allow anybody to obtain papyrus to write on. And the Pergamons invented parchment, which is much more expensive, but from the skin of animals. And they were able to, so the idea of parchment, which became such a universal writing medium for the next 2,000 years, was invented in Pergamum. And you have to imagine how rich they were to be able to use animals, which were expensive, as opposed to, reeds that were growing in the Nile Delta.
And one more thing, the reason why Pergamon is no longer like a major site is in Turkey is because it was stripped. And it was stripped by Germans. And as probably many of you know, there is a famous Pergamon museum in Berlin, which I've been to. It is absolutely fantastic. It's mind-boggling. And there are many, the reconstruction of almost the whole kind of part of the city in different parts of the museum. And of course, Pergamon, a lot of it was stripped, and in that museum, there is a lot from Babylon is in that museum, the whole Babylon gate. It's something like, for those of you from New York, like, there is this, in Metropolitan Museum, there is this Egyptian temple, the Pergamon Museum has many huge rooms with like real thing from various sites, famous sites like Babylon, Pergamon, and many others. So that's something to visit if you haven't been to. But it is called Pergamon because apparently the original exhibition was from there. Okay. All right. So, okay. Here is the confirmation from, yeah. Okay. Anyone else have any other comments, questions? Let's give it a few more minutes, and anything you want to talk about anymore? I mean, Paul, this was great presentation. I mean, I loved it, especially I like the family trees, so you connect everything to who is who and how they connected. I think that's also very important. And now everybody there is connected, all these families, and considering that Aemilianus and Tiberius were relatives, and Tiberius actually, I understand, spent a lot of his youth in Aemilianus' house. Were kind of like considered him a mentor, Tiberius, and then eventually they became kind of enemies, political enemies.
There was actually more interreaction that I kind of simplified the family tree because I didn't want to overwhelm people with detail, but
Sempronia, right?
That was this. Cato was also married into that family.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Cato the censor
Right, the elder.
The elder Cato, who was one of the most eminent Romans.
Yeah, the conservative, you would say, like this is a conservative branch.
Yeah, Cato,
Uh,
and I really understanding the Roman attitude towards slavery is another thing that people that comes out of this. You know, Cato published. Cato was a writer, and some of his writings have survived, and one of them is called On Agriculture. And in it, Cato describes slaves as thinking tools and basically explains to you how to wring every last bit of value out of them and then get rid of them before you have to support them in old age when they're incapable of giving anything back to you. I mean, it sounded, you know, it was like Auschwitz without the gas chamber.
Yeah, and I think even I think I know Livy kind of got a lot of information from Cato, and I think even Polybius too, because he was older and he wrote about history as well. I mean, because you know Polybius also wrote about the first and second Punic Wars, that he was not a witness. He was a witness to the third one and the destruction of Carthage. He is it's actually unique, the witness account of the siege and the destruction. But he also wrote about first and second Punic Wars, and I think he took a lot of material from Cato.
You know, I'm taking a course now in religions of the Roman world, and I was assigned reading was a section of Cicero, and this is from his dialogue on the nature of the gods, and the protagonist of this dialogue is Scipio Aemilianus. And what's going on in this dialogue, I don't know whether this is supposed to be a dream or something like that, but Scipio Aemilianus meets the ghost of Scipio Africanus. And since Scipio Aemilianus was also called Africanus,
right,
you have Africanus talking to Africanus, and the senior Africanus is telling him, you know, that you have to behave the right way and so forth. And then Scipio says, is my father there? Is there really an afterlife? And who walks in but Aemilius Paulus, who then starts, you know, having this long discussion with his son about glory and the importance of seeking the interests of the state. Kind of not all that theoretically. I mean, Cicero as a philosopher is not very well respected, but nevertheless, really interesting views of the way the Romans saw their own celebrities.
I always find it fascinating how Caesar, who was from senatorial class, became popularis, and Cicero, who was equity, like middle class, became optimates. You know how it's really strange.
Yes, and Cicero was never quite accepted. You know, he
right, because he was not senatorial class.
Yes, right, and he was not even long-term plebeian nobility. He came from the sticks. He was what the Romans called a new man, which is to say that he was the very first man in his family to achieve the consulship. And these people were, you know, the Senate was contemptuous of new men. Gaius Marius was a new man.
Yeah, but he was promoting the Optimates.
He was a wannabe.
Yeah. That's.
And they didn't, and he wasn't really accepted by them, you know, until the Civil War. Until it was, you know, which side are you on, Caesar or Pompey?
Right. But still, Caesar forgave him You know, we're not there yet, but since we're just talking, you know, I always admired the Caesar's ability to forgive his enemies.
Clemency. And
Like
Augustus,
I don't know anybody like that.
and Augustus, who, as I said, really closely watched what Julius Caesar did, said, okay, clemency may be good for you, but not for me. You know, I'm not going to have some guy in the forum, you know, 28 people stick a knife in me because I let all of them free when they tried to kill me.
Sure. Yeah.
So Caesar's clemency died with Caesar.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, it probably, led to that assassination.
Another reason, by the way, why Augustus was so anxious to have himself declared sacrosanct.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, all right. Last chance. Anything to say? I don't know how to unmute everybody. Maybe Zach can do it. I don't know how to do this. But anyone wants to talk, I can definitely raise your hand before we finish. We're almost at the end. It's 1:50, so we actually all close to 2 hours. Give it 30 seconds for anyone to step in or all right. I guess that's it. Okay. Thank you, Paul. It was fantastic. You know, I enjoyed it, and you know, I'm very much into it. I still learned quite a few things. All right, excellent presentation. Great.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I'm closing this meeting. Okay. All right, there are a number of thank yous. I guess you could see you can see Paul, the chat. All right, okay. So have a great day, everyone, and see you next time at other presentations. All the best. Thank you.